Welcome to The Cusp, a podcast that tries to give you the straight dope on what's actually happening with artificial intelligence, how jobs are changing, and what that means for education and workforce development. I'm Paul Fain, editor of the Job newsletter and co-founder of WorkShift. Thanks for listening. Summer is winding down, sadly. Hope you all got some time off. For this episode, my producer Mike Palmer and I have pulled together some of the highlights so far from season 1. It kicks off with my introduction of The Cusp on a stage at South by Southwest EDU, then moves through a few of our favorite moments from expert interviews on the show. Coming at you right now. So I'm dating myself. I've been covering higher education and things thereabouts for over 2 decades. And I have to say there's only 3 knock over my chair moments as a journalist. And that's a literal thing. In 2007, when the market collapsed and Lehman Brothers shut down, I stood up at the Chronicle of Higher Education and knocked over my chair. I'd seen that the market was down like 700 points. And you didn't have to be smart to know, like, this is big. University endowments collapsed. Everything changed, to the pace of coverage, everything. And it meant, like, my beat, I had to tear up and start over again. The second time, as you all may remember, something happened at the beginning of 2020. And, I was at Inside Higher Ed then, and we had access to infectious disease experts at places like the University of Washington and Princeton who said, hey, buckle up. This is going to be way worse than you even think. And I remember talking to a community college president in my hometown of Dayton, Ohio, Sinclair College, Steve Johnson. And it was my last time out at a restaurant for a very long time. I met him in DC, and he said they had formed a war room. Everything was going to change, absolutely everything. So we tore up our website at Inside Higher Ed, and everything was COVID for a very long time. I think this is one of those moments. It's different in a lot of ways, but I think, people who know things tell me they are bullish that we are on the cusp of big change. And what it is ain't exactly clear, but something is coming, something big, something soon that's going to affect probably all of us in many ways. Here's one of those people who knows things about artificial intelligence and what they mean for higher education. George Siemens, co-founder, chief scientist, and architect of Southern New Hampshire University's Human Systems Project.
Now, it doesn't have to change everything. And he gets a little bit of a mistake sometimes that it's a light switch perspective, right? It's either completely changing everything or not changing anything. But you can see, even if it changed and reduced 15% of the writing time on pulling a creative document together, that's 15% of time that can be allocated to something else. And so starting to see that come on and starting to see how quickly people adopted it and how much it took people back, it really struck me as this is the thing that we have to get on top of. And when I was sending emails to colleagues, I was like, this isn't an important thing. I said, this is the only important thing. And so that was just that feeling of we're dealing with something that we can integrate into our human cognitive system.
George shared thoughts with us about what sort of changes in the works and what we don't know at this point.
What we don't know well is the trusted capabilities of AI. You still hear things, well, it's, hallucination, even though that conversation's diminished. There's questions around reasoning and mathematical reasoning. There's questions around the ability for us to completely trust the tools that we're now starting to see coming into our Microsoft and into our Google workplaces or our Amazon services, depending on what you're doing. I think that's a big open set of questions is this reliable? Do we trust this? And how do we use this in an effective and a meaningful way? And that's probably, one of the first ones that we're bumping up against. Another part that's coming up fairly quickly is what are the actual points of integration between human and AI? What is it that we need to know, and how do we begin to know those things to move forward? So I emphasize in particular, again, my lens is the university perspective, but I emphasize in particular that the best way to get to figure out how we respond is to play with AI every day. I mean, the common mantra with peers and colleagues is find a new tool, see what it does, play with it, get frustrated with it, but embed it into what you're doing, whether it's your writing or your brainstorming, play with neat, cool features, see what's the support mechanism that might have, and think about it over time.
I also asked George for his thoughts on how university leaders should be meeting this moment. He didn't hold back with his response.
Now, if a university president sat me down and said, okay, we looked at this, and for these and these reasons, we think AI shouldn't be a critical area of focus, I'm like, okay, you've got a reason, you've thought it through, you've had discussions with your senior team, you have a vision for what a university should be in the age of AI, where declarative knowledge is increasingly diminished as a critical value point, not down to zero, but definitely less consequential, and new skills are needed to participate in this emerging economy. Great. You sat that down with your leadership team and worked it through, and you said, you know what? AI isn't a big deal for us. But that's not happening. What we're having instead is an abdication of responsibility. And it's almost like negligence, as I said, to not sit down and have that conversation. So it's defaulting to, well, we'll just, let things ride rather than respond to it. I mean, if you were to look at a university, just capabilities I think a university should have, as of now, I would absolutely expect that they would know at a pretty solid level, how LLMs work, how to tune LLMs, how to use LLMs to solve problems internally within a university, just faculty and staff, access to their own materials, curricular-wise, administrative-wise, and so on. I would expect that they would know how to build the bot that helps students interact with that. I would expect that they would have a range of tools that they'd have embedded in different parts of their curriculum just to test the tires of what this might do. We don't know what this does yet, and we don't know exactly how it fits into the system of learning at this stage. So I think that's why that's such a critical point. But it's the intentionality of doing something or doing nothing with AI. If you decide AI doesn't matter, make it an intentional decision and communicate your logic to your university or to your stakeholders within that community. We need to make sure that what happened with Web 2.0 and social media, as the increasingly negative effects of phone use and constant manipulation psychologically from apps and attention getting and so on, we need to make sure that we are not letting the AI conversation unfold in the same laissez-faire, lackadaisical kind of way. We need to be much more active in the ethics and the impact and the social details of it than we've previously been.
Ben Armstrong and his team of colleagues at MIT's Industrial Performance Center have access to some of the best available data about how AI is changing jobs. We were fortunate to be able to speak with Ben about what the Work of the Future project has found with its research, including what sort of productivity gains are being realized by companies.
We started some research last summer where we heard a lot of the hype that this technology was the most significant in our generation, that it was going to transform worker productivity. There was some worries, as I'm sure you've chronicled, about huge numbers of jobs being displaced. And from my perspective, I've been studying automation in work and mostly in manufacturing contexts, kind of the displacement of, or the transformation, I should say, of middle skill jobs. I was wondering whether this was actually the case. We had heard this story before around robots. In 2018, the famous paper from Frey and Osborne suggesting that 47% of all jobs were vulnerable to automation by 2030, which of course, is not never came to pass and turns out to be just a flawed methodology. But it seemed like the same cycle of hype and dread in some cases was repeating itself. I would say furious optimism, but also some pretty serious pessimism. So what we wanted to do in beginning last summer was to cut through some of that hype and understand how this technology was actually playing out in the field. So we started reaching out to companies that were experimenting with generative AI and that had worked with various more narrow AI applications in the past. And we asked them if they would want to participate in case studies, if we could track how they were using the technology. So we hopped on dozens and dozens of mostly Zoom calls to do interviews with these companies, heads of data science, heads of HR, to really get a sense of what this technology was doing out in the field and what the vision was for these companies, how they imagined it could transform different jobs. And that's really what we've been working on for the past 6 months or so. We have a team of about a dozen people at MIT, mostly engineers, computer science types, some social scientists like myself. And it's been a really exciting process so far where we've engaged with somewhere around 40, 50 companies, mostly large Fortune 500 types. And then we have a set of about a dozen more intensive case studies where we're looking at how different occupations have the potential to be changed. And what I would say, if I'm just summarizing what we've learned so far,
Sure.
is that a lot of the changes with this technology look really similar to changes from past technologies. Of course, there's a lot of early investment and a lot of speed with which companies are trying to deploy LLM-based tools, but it doesn't seem so dramatically different than the adoption of personal computers or the adoption and deployment of new internet or cloud-based tools into the workplace, as far as we can tell so far. Now, the critique of that, of course, is like, it's early, it's only a year and
Right.
a half in, but it does seem like the effect on jobs so far and the roadmap, I would say maybe a year out, has been very incremental.
So the impact on jobs has been incremental so far, no matter what you might have read. I asked Ben if that incrementalism extends to industries where change is predicted sooner than later, including medicine, software engineering, and the legal profession.
I don't think there's a huge gap in terms of industry. Of course, there are some companies that have been experimenting early and often and are more open to trying things out, but I don't think it really breaks down by industry as cleanly as you might think. What's been interesting is that generative AI can really help with this. And what it can do is it can maybe suggest responses to, any patient question, medical question you might have. But this hasn't been a huge hit with doctors that we've seen in some early evidence, in part because the hospital systems want to be very cautious with what is actually suggested. Is there medical advice that the algorithm's providing? Patients probably don't, they want their doctor to be providing the medical advice, not the algorithm.
Right.
And if it's not providing medical advice, its usefulness might be more limited. So there's really a difficult integration problem with this in-basket messaging and when it's prompting doctors with potential responses that we see in early, I would say very early evidence has hit more roadblocks than the summarization work. I don't think we know yet, but I could imagine a couple different paths that we go down. And this is really the two possible futures that people are seeing. One is a future where expertise, let's say the domain expertise, is at even more of a premium. So even though you have an algorithm that can help you read a scan, the value isn't necessarily on someone who knows the process around scan reading, but can have the algorithm read the scan for them, which might be the lower skilled person who's entry level, call it future one. It's instead the person who's seen so many scans that can tell when the algorithm gets it wrong. So there's someone who's doing the ultimate checking and has the expertise and also can understand perhaps why this is perceived as anomalous, like can spot the anomaly, even if the algorithm is a black box and can't tell you on its own.
Right.
So to give you another example of this, if you have, for example, someone who's programming, you might find that a software engineer who knows the architecture that they want and has seen very high quality code in a similar application in the past is more equipped to respond and see if the generative AI's output is going to be useful than a junior engineer who's never seen this type of application before and who doesn't actually have a lot of experience knowing what good code looks like. And in the legal profession, we've seen some of this around kind of contracting, document review, document preparation, that sort of thing. But then when you think about it, the biggest real transformation in the legal profession is just, copy paste and optical character recognition, which has been around for a long time.
Right.
It's like, you have template documents. It's not like you need generative AI to produce a new variation of a particular template or do form filling. That's been around. So sometimes we start talking about these applications without thinking if generative AI is the right technology fit for the task. Some organizations that we've talked to, they've in soul searching around generative AI have found these tasks that certainly could be augmented with technology, but generative AI is not the appropriate technology at all, right? So it's this type of thing where typically you start with the problem and then you figure out what the most appropriate technology is. Here we're starting with the technology oftentimes, then working our way back is, hey, what can we do with this exciting new tool? But to answer your question with lawyers, one of my colleagues, a law professor, has been starting to study this, and his hypothesis, at least, is that there's this bifurcation within law that's been around for a long time, which is kind of prestige, very highly paid law firms, the ones that you see, representing high profile clients or doing the white shoe work. Those folks have a lot of human interactions and kind of expertise in reasoning that will lead them not really to rely on these tools and not really be augmented that much by this technology. But then you have a bulk of the legal profession that's doing much more routine work that is trying to get more work out each day and has kind of a backlog of work for clients that is variations on the same theme where generative AI can actually be hugely helpful for summarization. There might be new additions in terms of form filling. So that is what his prediction is, that it'll look very bifurcated in how the tools are used.
What does all this mean for educators and job training providers? Here's Ben's take.
I feel like there's a more maybe reactive attitude within educational institutions. And then there's also, I think, this question about how the curricula should change or whether we should create new programs in AI or generative AI. And this is a question for community colleges and four-year institutions alike. Not my expertise. I've seen a couple models though that might be useful. So one is a more, I would say, integrated model where rather than create new programs, you try to examine how these new technologies might manifest in every different discipline. So for humanities courses, looking at how the presence of this new technology might change the way we think about longstanding topics in the humanities. Of course, changing assignments so that you can develop the same skills and the skills aren't, you know, and they don't atrophy with the presence of generative AI. This is one thing that I thought has done really well with ethics and new technology. So we have a program called Social and Ethical Responsibilities of Computing. And rather than make that a course standing on its own, instead, the effort was to embed modules of ethics and responsibility into all sorts of engineering courses, computer science courses, et cetera. The second question that I have, which I've debated it, I don't know whether it's right, but my sense is that it's unclear to me whether using generative AI is really a skill that we should be teaching in colleges or, universities at all. The first reason why might be obvious is it's not really like it's a skill to interpret what the algorithm gives you, but it's not really like some people say prompting's a skill. Unclear to me whether you need that much of a course in it. And part of the reason I say that is because these top companies that are ready to deploy this all through their organization, they have trainings for like 12 minutes.
Yeah.
It's not like they have a week-long course on this, and they feel comfortable because the tool is designed to be so easy to use. Really, the training needs to be on how do you interpret it, which is about domain expertise. It's not about, how do you prompt? How does one prompt get you more effective answer than another?
Following Ben was Katy Knight, executive director of the Siegel Family Endowment, which works on technology's impacts on society.
I think there's a lot more promise in the forms of technology that still keep a human in the loop somehow. And that's just true across the board. But I think particularly in this instance, there's both a comfort and a scale factor, I think, with humans. So if we don't think about AI as a replacement or a standalone being able to change people's lives, how can AI help a human change another human's skills? How can AI help a human teach 3 people instead of 1 person how to do something? Like, I think those are the levers that I'd like to see us experiment with in philanthropy with some of the programs that we work with on how they may apply these new tools in those ways and help the most currently underserved in terms of access to skills and training, the people with the least time and the least money, to gain some of them in a more practical way by trying to make it less burdensome to do hands-on learning in your current job.
Absolutely. And I think even a layperson like me can see professions where that might play out in a way that is good for society. I talked with Dr. Armstrong about his colleague David Otter's predictions that this could be good for the middle class. But of course, in the same sense, you think about the easy supply for some of these skills, which could lead to wage depression, has been described. I mean, we can see you get somebody to do this work more efficiently, and then you lay other people off. I mean, there's some dark scenarios too. And, I kind of wonder where you are at this point. I know it's very hard, and your level of optimism about maybe cracking some barriers.
I feel cautiously optimistic. My highest level of optimism I possess as a philanthropy professional. We were actually talking about this a bit in an internal meeting. I was talking to John Irons, our head of research. He's an economist and previously worked on the future of workers portfolio at Ford. So he has a lot to say about these topics. And we were talking about worker power. And a lot of philanthropy and nonprofit work is sort of defaulting to worker power as the answer to how maybe some of these things can be solved. And we settled on the idea that that's a really important component, but it can't be the only thing that we rely on to make sure that AI and other technologies are having a fairer impact across the workforce. So we have to be thinking about more comprehensive policy solutions and tech design solutions.
Katy also previously worked at Google. I asked Katy how optimistic she is about what AI means for education and jobs.
I really think there's a lot of opportunity if we engage more directly with people in their jobs and ask them, what could technology be useful for? Or even just what are the gaps? What are your needs? And then design toward that. We just don't do that enough in the tech industry. And I think there are a lot of really interesting and important efforts to try to change that design equation rather than here's a chatbot, figure out how to apply it to your work. Here's a problem that we have in this industry, or here's a training that we'd like to solve, or how can technology be helpful? What do we need first? And then what are the tools? Rather than here's a bunch of tools, figure out something to do with them.
Part of the Siegel Endowment's focus is ensuring that students have equal access to technology and emerging tools. That's going to be a challenge with AI.
I think access to AI is incredibly dependent on access to the internet. We have not solved that problem at scale in the United States, much less globally. So we can't rely on AI or any other emerging technology like it to be a savior if we know factually that there are just a ton of people who will not have access at home. And that when you think about just the necessary computing power to really play with AI, to really dig in and create your own custom chatbot, it's just not available in a home where the primary internet access is through a cell phone. And so we have to be thinking about addressing that problem. It's part of why I had originally said in the foundation, we're not necessarily focused on the traditional aspects of the digital divide in terms of the hard assets, the physical infrastructure assets. We've returned to that question a bit to start thinking about the world beyond broadband and how we try to re-engage with efforts to get access to more people, because AI cannot be, I have my doubts about whether it'd be a great equalizer in general, but it absolutely can't if there's not access to technology, to the internet in people's homes. So that's one piece of it. And then the other piece is just how people have access to AI. If your only access is through kind of a public free chat GPT version of a tool instead of the back end of being able to play with and understand more of what a large language model is and what AI does and how it's built. And so those sort of divides are what worry me, is how are we teaching? And again, it comes back to computational thinking and computing literacy in a big way. How are we making sure that we're not just giving kids in under-resourced schools the free version of a tool and all they ever know is it's a magic black box, and then giving another set of young people access to understand how the box was built and what's actually inside of it. And I think there's opportunity for our community colleges, for libraries in particular. Libraries have been really key in digital divide issues in a way that I don't think people recognize. So can we fund libraries to do that work more? Community colleges, other sort of, we talk about civic knowledge infrastructure internally at SFE. And so what's the knowledge infrastructure we need to get more people access to AI knowledge is an important question.
Like several other experts who've appeared on the Cusp, Katy made a strong case for trying out AI tools in your work.
Yeah, I don't use chat bots as much as people might expect given my role, but I have been playing with these tools. And I definitely would advise people who expect this to play a role in their job somehow to be playing with them. But with the mindset, I think that this is a large language model, not a large knowledge model. So when you're playing with it, ask yourself, what am I doing with a tool that is really good at predicting language? Not what am I doing with a tool that has all the knowledge of the internet on it? Because what the AI has learned is about a pattern recognition related to what word should come next in this sentence. And then there's some randomization. And that's, my oversimplified perspective. But I think playing with these tools with the right mindset allows you to see their limitations a little bit faster and engage with them a little differently in my experience. As I'm looking to what philanthropy can be doing here, I think it's really important that we not try to reinvent the wheel and consider all of this as brand new. There are new components, but there's also a lot that we've learned from in the past. And we don't have to know everything about AI in order to make moves and place some bets and do some work here. And I think we're often inclined to wait until there's more research or wait until there's a better developed theory of change, but this is not necessarily that moment. So let's engage and dig in and be in the messy part, because that's how we end up shaping the technology, with that collective feedback to industry and by building our own tools because we know how they work. So I'm excited for us to take that approach and to be thinking that way, and not just like, all right, we've got to figure this out sometime in the next 5 years.
Alex Swartzel is helping to lead the new Center for Artificial Intelligence and the Future of Work at Jobs for the Future. I asked Alex and her colleague, Tiffany Shea, how educators should be thinking about how to prepare students for the workforce, particularly as what we know about AI changes on a weekly basis.
Doubling down on durable skills is the beginning, middle, and end of our thinking about this so far. Just our own research released last November is showing that those are going to be the skills that are sustained even as AI comes to the forefront, and can create opportunities for AI to unlock those skills in new ways, which is really exciting. And so the more that we can help prepare people at all levels of our education and workforce system to leverage those kinds of skills, especially as the half-life of technical skills is constantly shortening, even as AI skills themselves will continue to evolve as the technology changes, that's going to be essential. We're all seeing this can make us faster incrementally at some tasks, and that's going to be great. Productivity increases on the margins, and in some cases, in really more meaningful ways, will be exciting. But I think that the potential of the technology is bigger than that, especially when we think about its implications for the future of work and especially for economic mobility. So that's what I think we're not fully seeing yet, and we're excited to continue to explore.
Few people have more of a broadly informed view about AI's potential in education than Lydia Logan, IBM's Vice President of Global Education and Workforce Development. We were fortunate to have Lydia on the show.
There's a lot of talking about the half-life of skills and how it's getting shorter. Half-life of skills, half-life of degrees. What do you need to do in order to keep current? That's why I started out the conversation by saying, lean in, because it's only going to keep changing. You don't have to necessarily be a first mover or first adopter, but you do need to educate yourself, understand, dip your toe in the water, do it in a personal setting, use one of the generative AI tools and create a playlist for yourself. Learn to enter some successive prompts in a low stakes way so that you can get comfortable with it. And then think about how you would use it in an academic setting, in a classroom. How can you do some creative things with the content? How can you do things to help yourself gain efficiencies? We all know that educators are swamped. And if you can find ways to either buy yourself time so that you're spending more time with students, again, getting back to higher order activities, the most important thing you can do is to be working with your students and automate some of the things that it takes you to do to prepare or the follow-up. So if you can automate some of those things, how do you lean in for your students with your students? And that's at any level, right? That's in K-12, that's in higher ed, that's in our, post-secondary institutions, whether you're in a degree or non-degree pathway. Think about how you're doing it. We want people to have access in a way that's approachable. We want to make sure that it's quality content, and we want to make sure that we are meeting people where they are, and then they can level up all the way up to, professional IBM, product certification at the professional level. But everyone needs to be able to start somewhere. And so I think it's incumbent upon all of us to understand, like I was saying before, where does your responsibility of understanding what happens to your data? When do you use it? When do you not use it, right? Do you know where it's going? Do you know what's going to be used? Do you know what you've provided permission for yourself and for your kids if you have them? Which is why it's important in school settings to think about how it's being used in the classroom. What are your policies around new technologies? What's your CTO thinking about, your CIO? A lot of it's free, so it isn't even necessarily a question about costs, but it may be more around educator training coaches, or thinking through these things, with experts. But again, keep up. So don't let it overwhelm you, and don't let it stop you. Educate yourself and just make sure you take the first step.
Edith Yang is a senior research associate at MDRC, where she's studying how AI could benefit learners. Edith shared a personal anecdote with me to describe how the tech could paradoxically give a boost to human connection.
And I'm thinking about a personal anecdote from, 10 years ago. So I am a domestic violence survivor. And 10 years ago, I found myself navigating the support systems in New York City, the legal systems in New York City. And I got connected to a wonderful social worker who came with me to my court appointments, who listened to me, who validated my feelings, who gave me perspectives that I could then move on to. And, I think that if AI had been around there, then her job could have been a lot easier. Her time burdens with paperwork, with really researching like what types of services that I, as an Asian female coming from a more privileged background, but may have not had complete financial control of everything, AI could have helped her to more efficiently direct me to the services that I needed.
If you haven't checked out the AI Education Project, the nonprofit group's work is definitely worth a look. Alex Kotran, the CEO of AI EDU, shared his teacher-centric view of how to think about the technology in K-12 education and the importance of AI literacy for students, teachers, and school leaders.
The challenge is that, administrators are being inundated with companies trying to peddle AI tools. And so there's a lot of talk about like policies and guidelines and what tools do we buy and what are the procurement standards, what are standards of efficacy, what are the use cases. So that's where a lot of schools' heads are at. I think the bigger question is, what does it look like to prepare every single student with AI literacy, where this is no longer something that's siloed into a STEM track? 6% of kids in the US are enrolled in an introductory computer science class. If 6% of kids graduate with AI literacy, that is a very, very bad outcome. So schools, I think, the schools that we talk to that are working with AI EDU, they're starting to hone in on like, what would it look like for us to make AI education something that looks more like the way we talk about the internet? And, you don't have a track for the internet. Every student is using the internet, in many cases in most of their classes. And I think AI is going to look more like that, where it's something that's integrated across the learning experience. It's folly to try to use tools to block and catch students using ChatGPT. The real solution is we have to, redefine the way we do assessments and the way we assign homework and the type of work products that students are creating. And also, it's going to be less about the work product and more about the process to getting there. Kind of like with calculators, like we figured out, you need to actually show your work, and students are getting more points in many cases based on the work that they show, not necessarily just getting the right answer. But to figure that stuff out, it's not just like a cheat sheet that you hand out to teachers. It really is sort of like holistic knowledge and sort of an intuitive understanding of what the tools are capable of so that teachers can design around it. And I just, my parents are both educators. My mom has taught math and Akron public schools her whole career. So I really believe in this sort of teacher-centric approach. And my concern is that we aren't equipping teachers to be at the table and co-designing these systems. And that's, I think, really critical if we want to have positive outcomes in the education system. The challenge for schools is we're going to have to adapt to an environment where we don't know what the jobs of the future are. But I think what we can say with a bit more certainty is, what are the skills of the future?
Right.
And to me, it's like, okay, if you want to figure out, is my job at risk of being replaced by AI? Open up your calendar. How many meetings do you have on your calendar? Are you spending most of your day interacting with people or with customers or with clients? Or are you an individual contributor where you're doing a lot of writing, a lot of coding, a lot of analysis? And if it's the latter, those are the type of jobs that are probably going to be, the lower hanging fruit. And again, it's not that the whole job gets replaced. It's just, can we extract some efficiency with some of these productivity tools?
Thanks to all the guests who generously shared their time and expertise with us on The Cusp. I'll be back soon with a new episode. Please subscribe to the show so you don't miss anything. And to hear more from any of these interviews that may have piqued your interest, you can find the full episodes at our flagship publication, WorkShift, www.workshift.org. The launch of this podcast was made possible by the collective philanthropic support of the Walmart Foundation, GitLab Foundation, Cognizant, and the K4 Center. Thanks to our supporters and to you all for listening. Catch you next time.